Well, for those that I haven't had the chance to meet before, my name is Rick Rosso. I run the program on India and emerging Asia economics here at CSIS. I'm also today your designated security officer, a mandatory announcement for every CSIS event. So if a fire alarm gets pulled or something else happens, please follow me and we'll calmly walk out to the corner, and our CEO, Dr. Hamre, promises he will buy everybody ice cream. So there's something at the end of that. Next up, why are you all here? It's middle of summer. You're not supposed to have crowds like this in the middle of summer, but I think we all know it's because we have a very special guest here today. And to be able to hold an event like this while there's so much happening in the US-India lane and around the world, hoping and looking at India as that kind of that beacon of growth and prosperity. US-India commercial ties are certainly on the front of everybody's minds, mainly due to the ongoing talks for a US-India trade deal. And our chief guest, of course, can speak to that at length if he chooses to, and maybe that'll come up at Q&A, since he was one of the first great proponents of India's integration of trade and investment with the world. But trade policy isn't the only thing, and in some ways may not even be the most important thing that's going to drive India's development story. It's going to be about what happens at all levels of government, that openness to investment, that the way that fiscal transfers work between different levels. These are the fundamental enablers of success for infrastructure, removing business impediments and such. I'm not sure that any person alive has as much experience at the policy level and practical level on how India at all levels is undertaking this journey than my good friend and mentor, Dr. Arvind Panagariya. Dr. Panagariya, for those that aren't familiar, and I'm sure if you're here, you definitely are very familiar, but he's the chairman of the 16th Finance Commission, also professor of economics and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University. So many incredible roles in the past, including the inaugural vice chairman of NITI Aayog when that was created, starting back in 2015. Former chief economist of the Asian Development Bank, University of Maryland professor, worked at the World Bank, the IMF, and UNCTAD. So pretty much every cool role I'd ever want to have in life, with the exception of quarterback for the Washington Commanders. So that's the only thing we're missing so far. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Panagariya. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. It is such a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here. So what I'll do is maybe take 25 minutes or so to lay out a few thoughts on India. The canvas is so wide that I cannot really cover in 25 minutes all of it, but I'm very much hoping that, things that I don't cover would come up in the Q&A session. So please, get your questions.
Except for any details on the Finance Commission report. That's off the...
I should say, that goes without saying that don't waste your question on asking what will the Finance Commission do on this or that. That's not something that I will answer. Answer to that question is likely to be that no decisions have been made, and it will all be determined by the members of the commission. I'm only the chairman of the commission. There are 4 other members who have the decision-making power. So other than that, I think for most other issues we can talk about. Even though the subject may have been a little bit different when we circulated the subject, I'll talk a little bit about, where India stands and where I see India going. I have a very upbeat view of India. I am not unaware of the challenges. So I will come to the challenges also. But first I would start with my kind of upbeat view of India. I'll start, let's say, first telling a little bit about India's growth story in recent years, and I'll maybe start by focusing first on the years under the present Prime Minister. And then I want to take it to a broader question of, where India is headed in the next 2 decades, 2.5 decades. Very speculative, but nevertheless backed by certain, at least some facts and some arguments, against the backdrop of the Prime Minister having expressed this ambition that he wants to turn India into a developed country by its 100th anniversary of independence, which is in 2047. and really also posing the question whether that is a feasible ambition, and how do we interpret that ambition for the purpose of our discussion and all. So first of all, if I take, the 11 years of Prime Minister Modi, there have been at least two crises in between during that period. One was the internal financial crisis. The non-performing assets of the banks really led to near collapse of credit growth, and then also spilled over into the non-bank finance company crisis, NBFC crisis, which led to, in the years, particularly 2019, but also a bit of 2018. Sometimes I will refer to 18, 19, 19, 20. India's fiscal year runs from 1st April to March 31st. So it sort of overlaps over two different years. I'll try to just simplify it, where 9 months are in the first part of 1920, so 9 months of the 1920 are actually in 19. So I'll just call that 19. I'll try to do that. So 2018 and 19 actually got impacted by the crisis, and then you also have COVID hitting in 2020. So to divide this a little bit, that if I take the first 5 years of the first, so this is the first term, 2014 to 2018. That 5-year period, the growth in India in the real rupees, and this is a distinction I'm going to make eventually, looking at growth in terms of real rupees versus looking at growth in terms of dollars. There is a difference between the two. This growth rate for the first 5 years was 7.4%. Now then you have these 3 years, 2019, which is the year that financial crisis really hits hard. Growth rate drops to 3.9%. And then you come to the COVID year, 2020, when growth rate becomes negative. And then recovery happens, but of course, because, if the growth rate was negative in 2020 and almost negative 5% there, you would expect growth rate to spike up quite a bit. And it did happen in the year 2020 when India grew about 9%. What I'm going to do is, if I take these 3 years out of it, and then look at the growth rate again the following 3 years. So the last 3 years for which we have the data, which is 2022, 23, and 24. Growth rate once again works out to 7.8%. So there is this, somehow pessimism around growth rates, that somehow India's growth rate really has dropped to 6% or below 6%. Or, India is full of skeptics. So you hear this skepticism coming through, and especially a lot of the commentators really come from the investment banks and so forth. And pessimism really helps actually on the television. So it gets some traction. But the fact is, if you look at the growth rates carefully, now there is that 3-year period, obviously, which I have taken out. This is the crisis period. But that's not indicative of what I expect the Indian economy to do over a longer period of time. So I'm going to take a very long-term horizon when I talk about India's growth. So that's the first point, that at least during a crisis-free period, growth has been pretty robust, 7.4% during the first 5 years of the Modi government, and then last 3 years have been 7.8%. So underlying growth to me, minimally, and this is growth rates in real rupees, these are the numbers you normally see. Now, what can we expect going forward in the next, whatever, 23 or 24 years? This is the question about the Prime Minister's ambition, that can India become a developed economy in 2 decades plus 2.5 decades or so. Now, the first question one has to ask is that, what is really the definition of developed economy that one takes to assess the realism of that ambition. At a broad level, of course, you all live here, and so you see what is around, and US is a developed country, and so that is what a developed country is. And you can take that, but that's something not very quantifiable and the kind of assessment one wants to do. So what I want to do is take the definition of the high income country that the World Bank uses. I think that's really just about the only definition that we have. Only classification that we have is by the World Bank among the low income countries and low middle income and high middle income and then the high income. So by the World Bank's definition, the high income country has a per capita income of approximately, it's very close, so I want to take around figures of $14,000 in 2024 prices. So that is the per capita income that in 2024 dollars that we are looking at and asking the question whether India can cross that threshold by the year 2047. Right? So look back what the per capita income today is. India's per capita income still, in spite of a lot of the growth that has happened, because when growth began, India was at such a low per capita income that in spite of about 3 or more doublings in the last 20 years, it is still relatively low per capita income. So it's about currently $2,740. That is the current per capita income, $2,740, from which you are talking about going to 14,000 in 2047. So this is the 2024 figure. So it's comparable to the 14,000 in constant prices or constant dollars that I mentioned, which is the high income country level. To go from 2,740 to $14,000 in 23 years. We are 2024 figure. We are talking 2047. If you work out what the implicit compound rate of growth needs to be, that's about 7.3%. So the question we are asking is that can India's per capita income in real dollars, remember this is 2024 figure, so in real dollars, can the per capita income rise by 7.3% annual growth rate over the next 23 years? That is the question I would pose. Now to answer that, I go back a little bit. Is that figure anywhere close to what India has done over the last couple of decades? So I look back at India's performance over the last couple of decades. Now India's high growth story begins in the year 2003. That is the first time that this growth acceleration really picks up. Before that, there have been economic reforms starting in 1991. So we've gone through about 12 years of generally sustained economic reforms. Some years were a little patchy, not a lot of progress happened, a lot of prime ministers changed in a short period of time. But largely you can take the 2 long periods, 5 years under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and then 6 years under Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Sustained reforms which ultimately in 2003 placed India on this very high growth trajectory. What has been the growth rate along that trajectory since 2003? So again, let me take the years 2003 to, I'll not take up to 2019 actually, or let's say take 2018. Because 19, the financial crisis really hits hard, and then the COVID hits hard and all. So if I take 2003 to 2018, this 16-year period, India during this period in nominal dollars, in current dollars, has grown 12%. Now, this is not something that's really appreciated. Most people are not aware, whether in India or outside, that this was a period of enormous growth. And in current dollars, this growth rate was actually from 2003 to 2018, 12%. Now, take out the 2% growth of the GDP deflator of the United States. Right? That's a kind of inflation, so to say, that, if you look at the US incomes in current dollars versus constant dollars, then the difference in the growth rates is about 2%, which is the GDP deflator. Take that out, 10% is the growth rate in real dollars of India during 2003 to 2019, 2018, effect not often appreciated. During this period, there was one crisis, that was the global financial crisis in 2008. India weathered that. It did see a dip in growth rate during 1 year, but it recovered fast and came back to the original trajectory. So it really was able to grow on a sustained basis for 15 or 16 years at that very high rate. But if we also include the post 2018 years, 19, 20, all the way up to 24, if I take that long period, 2003 to 2024, which is a 21 or 22 year period, then the nominal growth rate, the current dollar growth rate comes to 10 point something, and 2.3% is the GDP deflator during that period. Remember the kind of inflation that the United States had during the COVID years, which really made that GDP deflator growth significantly higher. So from 2% it went to 2.3. Take that out, so you still get about, in real terms, in real dollars, India's GDP growth during this period, full long period 2003 to 2024, of about 7.8%. Right? So now come back. So what India has, if you take the longer period, India has grown 7.8% in real dollars. Now the difference in, I remember I gave you in the earlier, the rupee growth rates, which were 7.4, 7.8, some thereabouts. Where is this gap coming from? That gap is the appreciation of the rupee against the dollar in real terms. Okay? When India's inflation is higher than the US inflation, and the depreciation doesn't completely neutralize that difference, rupee is appreciating in real terms. So that real appreciation of the rupee, increase in the value of the rupee, gets added on to the rupee growth rate. So this gap is accounted for by the real appreciation of the rupee. Okay, so where are we? What I said earlier was that to get to this per capita income of $14,000 from the 2007 $40, I need a growth rate in per capita income of 7.3% each year. Add to that the population growth, which is about 0.6%. Those are the projections by the United Nations Population Division. So 7.3 plus 0.6 is 7.9% growth rate is what I need for the GDP. But I've done 7.8 if I take the long period, and I've done about 10% if I take the short period from 2003 to 2018. What that tells me is that what I've done in the past puts me very much into the ballpark. It's feasible. It is not something I have not done for about nearly 2 decades. And it is, in this sense, certainly there is a path. Whether that path will be realized or not, I have to argue that still, because we all know about things like the, middle income traps and so forth, that your incomes might rise rapidly for a period of time and then that may stop. So I have to still make that case that will India manage to grow, or is there a good case that India can really continue to sustain or even accelerate this growth rate a little bit? About 2 or 3 important factors on that front, on the positive side, and then I'll come to the challenges India faces. There's also issues of challenges. So first of all, one thing is that during this period, India had gone through 3 crises, the period that I've already described to you. One was the global financial crisis in 2007-8. Then India's own internal financial debacle, which led to these collapse of the credit growth and collapse in the NBFC sector. And the third was the COVID crisis. In spite of that, it has managed to do this growth, okay, on a sustained basis. Now, what else is going for India? First factor, India's per capita income is still quite low. It's still $2,740, I said. Today Singapore's per capita income is $82,000, US $80,000, South Korea $33,000, Japan somewhere in the low 30,000s and all. So what that tells me is that with the existing technology, it is possible to actually achieve a much higher level of per capita income than what India enjoys. This gap between what is feasible on the frontier and where India is very large. And so in terms of the catch-up, as economists call, there is a lot of scope, lot of room for this catch-up. Even if no technological progress were to happen in the next 23 years, existing technology is good enough to get there. You need to accumulate more capital, you need to be able to master the technology, move forward. And you're not, 23 years, if you're talking about getting to 14,000, that begins to look a pretty feasible target. So that's the first point, that there is a lot of room for catch-up. That still doesn't mean that, you won't get into the middle income trap and all, it can still happen. We can come to that, but right now, at least the feasibility is very much there, and that factor of difference in the per capita income that exists currently should work to India's advantage. The second factor is India's demography. Now, there are 2 aspects of India's demography. One, India's population is very large. It's 1.4 billion people. And 2, India is a young country. So in terms of the dependency ratios, India has a relatively low dependency ratios, and its population growth has still not peaked. It's now on, in terms of the total fertility rate, it is on roughly the replacement level, perhaps even a 0.1 below. So India's TFR by some measures is about 2 now. Replacement level is 2.1 for total fertility rate. But still, ultimately it's the death rate versus birth rate that have to, and as long as the birth rate still exceeds the death rate, population growth will continue. And this is where I mentioned the 0.6% growth rate that the United Nations Population Division predicts is coming from. So one, India has a large population, India has a young population. How does that help India? Well, in terms of the size, the large population, the big advantage comes in the provision of the public goods. If you're talking of infrastructure, roads, railways, civil aviation, whatnot, per capita cost of provision of public infrastructure becomes much lower. Because, in any geography, whether you got 1 million people or you got 2 million people, the cost of providing the infrastructure, if you are 2 million instead of 1 million, will not be twice of what you will need to spend to provide infrastructure to 1 million. Once the infrastructure is built, it's available to everybody. So the larger population in this sense leads to lower per capita cost of provision of public infrastructure. So as India is building these roads, railways, airports, seaports, etc., the larger population in a per capita sense, the cost-wise, there is an advantage. That advantage actually becomes even bigger when you talk about the digital infrastructure. Now, one thing India has done phenomenally well is in building its public digital infrastructure. It's really exemplary what India has done. I live in both the worlds, this meaning the United States and India. And I tell you, any digital transactions you need to do in India are way smoother and way more rapid and way less costly than they are here in the United States. It's quite amazing. Now, digital infrastructure is once you have built it, and India has really gone through very much a public route on it, and very successfully done so. The UPI, it's a platform where all the banks are present, all the people are present, and it handles all the transactions beautifully. There is a biometric verification that it does. Every citizen has a biometric record through which the verification happens, and transactions happen just like that in real time. Today, India accounts for the largest number of digital transactions in the world, and its own transactions, almost 40% or more, are on the digital platform. So there again, double whammy happens actually in terms of the provision, in terms of the cost of provision. First of all, the infrastructure itself costs a lot less on a per capita basis when you got large population. But in addition, from the user's point of view also, more the users, the greater the benefit for me from transacting. If you got on the platform 10 people transacting, 10 other people transacting, payoff for me of transacting on that platform is not very high. But if they've got 10 million people transacting on that platform, value of transacting on that platform actually increases. So that's the other factor. So that is the size aspect of demography, and then the youth, the young aspect, helps in two ways. One is that the worker to population ratio is high, and because young population, that automatically means that on a per capita basis, with the same productivity, I generate more output. Because more workers per 100 population means more output per 100 population. So that's one. The other is young population saves, whereas the old population, those of us who are older are living on the past accumulated savings, whereas the younger one for the future tries to save for the old age. That's the life cycle. And so the larger the proportion of the younger population, higher is my savings rate. So that also helps me. So that's my second set of points around the demography, which is working for India. The third factor is that finally India has learned to build infrastructure. And, I did about 3 years in India, 2015, 16, and 17. And I've now I returned about a year and a half ago. And the difference I see in the infrastructure is just phenomenal. And in my present job, actually, I have had to travel in last 1 year, from June 24 to June 25, every single state. There are 28 states in India, and part of the Finance Commission has to visit every single state and have meetings with the chief ministers and their staff and all. And as a part of that, I've really seen what a transformation that has happened on infrastructure, roads that have been built, high quality roads, wide roads, multiple lanes, and connectivity where it did not exist actually when I was back there till 2017. So that has happened. Also, if you look at some of the urban infrastructure, particularly Mumbai, unbelievable the kind of, the coastal road they have built. There is this large bridge that they have built. The scale on which I never saw India building is now happening. And connectivity on the border is just unbelievable. There is an organization called BRO, Border Road Organization, that has been building these fantastic roads going through the mountains. So we went into Sikkim and went into Ladakh and all, and heights of 13,000 feet and all, amazing roads, fantastically built and maintained. So that is happening. This is very positive, and digital I have already talked about and all. So that I think is another very much of a positive factor. And there are some reforms still outstanding which need to be done. And that I think is a positive also. Among them, I should mention one I will mention, which is very important. Currently, this negotiation that is ongoing with the United States on the trade agreement. Now, if that trade agreement happens, which it, as of now, looks very likely that it will happen. That is what one hears from the media. So, I'm sitting on a constitutional commission which really is not work with the government. So it's not based on any inside knowledge I have, but from all the media reports I see, the prospects look really great that this agreement will happen. If this agreement actually does happen, as it looks likely, then I think there will also be another follow-up agreement with the European Union. Now, if India really manages an agreement with the United States and European Union, as a part of which India will also liberalize its own trade regime in probably 90-95% of the products, bringing its tariffs to zero or near zero. Even if this happens over the next 10-year period, because there may be a phase-out period, at least with respect to the European Union, the United States may be even faster. That, I think, is a game changer for India, because that then, for any investor, makes India an incredibly attractive investment destination. Because then the goods inputs and outputs and everything can move without friction across these very large markets. That I think is, so that could be a big thing happening in favor of India. So that's the all positive side. Now the big challenge is the following, and I'll stop, so I'll take 2 or 3 more minutes to lay out what India's big challenge is. Now, developed country also means, that you look developed, right? and you all see this. Developed countries are much more urban, and generally the reliance of the workforce on agriculture is very small. I mean, of course, the US is an extreme case because it has been a rural country for many, many decades, if not centuries. But in the US, only 2% of the workforce is agricultural, and population is largely urban. Rural population was smaller. This is also true of South Korea, Taiwan, now even China to a very considerable degree, and all. That is the transition that needs to happen in India, which has not happened, or has happened very, very gradually. I think this is where the big challenge is. Today, about 46% of India's workforce is still in agriculture. That's too large, for a developed country status, that's too large a proportion. It has to come down to 30% or below. Can it happen over the next 23 years? That is a question mark there. I'll leave that. And likewise, urbanization. These are very interconnected phenomena. I mean, if you look at the history of UK, United States, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, all of these countries, you'll see that the transition out of agriculture into industry and services and urbanization go hand in hand. They happen together. Only difference is that, UK was the first one to do it, so the innovations were still happening, productivity was gradually rising, and also it took 200 years. US already had the technology that had already been, innovations that had already happened in the UK, so US could do it faster in about 100 years. Japan could do it in 55, 60 years. And then, of course, South Korea, Taiwan, and China, when they came in, the technology had moved way beyond where it was for the US or for Japan. And so they could do it in 30 years. But that process was the same. It happened faster in the late entrants, but this transition out of agriculture and urbanization both happened together. I mean, their link is very tight. And this is where I think, India's urbanization also has gone in very, very slowly. If you go back to 1951, 17% of India's population was urban. Today, it's probably 36% at the most, but our last census was 2011, unfortunately, and at that time it was about 31%. So 17 to 31 in 60 years, very slow process of urbanization. And likewise, our workforce in agriculture was about 70% in 1951. Today it's 46%. So some movement, some more urbanization, but still low rate. I think that part of transformation is something India, there's a big challenge, both of those, how to create better jobs in industry and services, which can then open the doors for the agricultural workforce to migrate into industry and services, and simultaneously speeding up urbanization. That is really the big challenge, which I think will have to be met if India really kind of is to turn into a developed country. So that is where I will stop, and we can now take questions.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I'm going to kick off with a few questions, and then we got some microphones that'll float around in a moment. But let me pull the thread on the last thing that you had brought up, the transition from agriculture to manufacturing and services. You know, we saw, I would say, during the Vajpayee government with some really strong policies that were released, like the Software Technology Parks Initiative, that gave a big impetus to the growth of the IT services industry. I would say, you know, with the Modi government's announcement of Make in India, you've seen a real prioritization of manufacturing, but growth still continues to come a lot from services. How would you say you kind of balance that going forward? Can India be a services-driven economy in perpetuity, or does manufacturing have to step up and play a much larger role?
So my view very much, which has remained unchanged over the last 20 years, is that manufacturing has to deliver better. In every one of the successful cases that I mentioned, you know, starting from UK all the way to China, manufacturing has been quite central. I don't see a case where, you know, services alone do it. Now, services help, there is no question, and you can see it's very intuitive why that helps. See, if manufacturing begins to grow, this is traded product, and so you got the global marketplace where you can reach out to your market even if it's small, you can produce large, because you can export and then import and whatever else you need in return. So manufacturing is not constrained by your domestic market. But when manufacturing grows, per capita incomes are rising. And as per capita incomes are rising, demand for locally produced services, which are generally non-traded, also rise. So you see a second round effect on the services growth. That also then starts pulling the agricultural workforce into these services. So both then industry and services pull the workers out of agriculture into these employments. But manufacturing has to be there, because services growth on its own, not some services are traded, admittedly, and you mentioned actually IT is a traded service. So there you can do it, but remember that these are not very employment intensive services. The employment-intensive services are the ones that are non-traded, you know, the everyday thing, fixing the cars, fixing the plumbing, fixing gardening, this, that, and the other. But for that, the incomes have to be there for demand to arise. And so, you know, while IT can help a bit, because that also generates a lot of income, and so that will generate some demand. But in the end, directly, it is manufacturing, you know, and what in India's case has not done well is the labor-intensive manufacturing. One has to make a very careful distinction between labor-intensive and highly capital-intensive. India's manufacturing structure has been so heavily capital-intensive. Many reasons for that, but you know, the big one being historical, that when India started its development journey, it started with investing in steel mills, machines that make machines. It was a very heavy industry. It was very heavy industry-driven industrialization, inspired by the Soviet experience initially. And that never went away. Whereas China, when it opened up, because of its very flexible labor and land markets, when it opened to foreign investment, the investors from Hong Kong, investors from Taiwan could quickly kind of move into these special economic zones, what used to be, you know, fishing villages in Shenzhen, for example, or Xiamen and all. These investors came in, and because of the flexibility of land and labor markets, very quickly kind of populate them with these labor-intensive industries. Because that's what they were doing at that time, and they were then beginning to lose the foothold in the global marketplace because of very high wages that had come to prevail in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. So they say, here is a cheap labor, here is a low wage labor and low land prices. Both of those actually helped them, and then that's what kicked off Chinese industrialization and created these jobs also, so that from the countryside the workforce moved. In India, this kind of bias in favor of very heavy industry, which is capital intensive, you're already a capital scarce country. And so you got, relative to your labor, your abundant factor is labor. That's where, you know, you got huge amount of resource. But you take this capital and put it into these very heavily capital-intensive sectors, or in IT sector, which is skilled labor-intensive, not the mass labor. What you have done is that, effectively your allocation of capital is not the best it could happen. You're not spreading it over these workers. These workers have no capital to work with. So their productivity remains low because in these still traditional kind of artisan type of activities or agriculture. The other fact, 46% in agriculture. Another 40% of India's workforce is in these enterprises which have less than 10 workers. These are not enterprises which have any capital whatsoever, or if they have a very small amount of capital. So your productivity is inevitably very low. You also do not acquire skills. See, this skill acquisition also, really genuine skill acquisition happens on the job. And you start working with some capital, then more complex capital comes in, so you acquire higher levels of skills. This is the way the skill level moves also, that as your country gets richer, it becomes more and more capital abundant, and it begins to acquire more and more complex machinery, and skills also rise. So none of that process in India has happened. And this is where I think India has to therefore get back to kicking off some of the restrictions that are keeping the labor-intensive industry. So we are talking about, I'll give the very dramatic example of apparel industry. Now, apparel industry market is more than 500 billion, the global export market, more than 500 billion. China till today is exporting something close to 160 to 80, somewhere there. $1 billion part of it. About 35% of the apparel exports today still come from China. Now, you would think that China really is doing high-tech stuff and this, that, and all the other, and wages 5 times those of India or Vietnam or Bangladesh, whoever. But China has not yet given up on the labor-intensive industry. Having a 35% share in apparel market with 5 times or more of the wages of most of these competing countries tells you, the productivity is very high in China. It's the labor productivity which has to compensate for. So this is where you see over the next 25 years, China is going to gradually quit this market, vacate these industries, labor-intensive industries. Now, apparel is one, but you've got tons of them: footwear, furniture, stationery, kitchenware, things of daily use, all kinds of things of daily use, all sort of electronic industry, all that. So there's a huge potential there. But there is still some reforms that need to be done for India to ultimately capture some of these industries.
I love, just a couple of weeks ago, your former home at NITI Aayog put out a report on how India can capture global manufacturing and power tools. And it's not top of the line for the big US-India conversation, power tools.
Right.
But these are the areas where, they sometimes get ignored in the big conversations. Yeah. But there's a lot of jobs and a lot of ability to attract investment in some of these areas that, fall between sometimes the cracks and don't get as much attention. Right. I think everybody probably gets a Columbia University degree after the master class we just heard too on this allocation of capital and the pathway for India to potentially achieve some victories here. I'm going to pull the thread on one more thing before I open up the floor, which is on trade agreements. You obviously were one of the biggest proponents for India's integration with the world, even before others were really talking about it so avidly. And now you've got a government in India, which I think initially, was a little more protectionist with tariffing. But about 6 years ago, you saw this dramatic change, where India is aggressive on trade agreements. They're lowering customs duties in the budgets rather than increasing. And it's a big turnaround and signing agreements. I think when the United States and India announced the intention, I was getting a lot of calls from the media saying, how do we get India excited about trade? They've been so difficult. And my rejoinder was at that time, India's signing trade agreements now, we're not. What's the mood in Delhi? Has there been the kind of blowback you might have expected by a government suddenly going kind of all in on trade talks? You've got deals with Australia, UAE, with the UK. These things are every couple of weeks, India's announcing deals with big partners. Has there been the kind of blowback on this that you might have expected, considering how hard there was pushback against that for decades? Or was the comfort level maybe there that people hadn't recognized before?
I think the governments learn as things go.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is happening, that trade agreements are possible. There are domestic interests you need to address, but you can use domestic instruments to address those. The United States does that, right? When, for example, the previous term, President Trump had imposed these tariffs on China, there were some retaliatory tariffs by China on soybean or things like that. You go in and use the domestic policy instruments, subsidies or what have you, to soften the blow and bring along some of the interests which may have been hurt. And I think that has been a bit of learning also, that India also is not thinking that, look, in the larger interests you need to open up. And particularly in the present context, for India, finally this idea that when you do the trade agreements, you are also getting access for your exports in the export markets has captured attention a bit better. And this really, when it happened in the present context of the United States raising the tariffs to very high levels and all, it's clearly really, generates a different dynamics. Yeah. So all that I think has contributed to it. But certainly I see that at least, as I said, I'm not a part of the government in my current position. But the vibes I hear generally, from people and the media and all, are that there is a great deal of anticipation in having the U.S.-India trade agreement done. Will it be sabotaged by some domestic interests and all? Who knows? That's something that remains to be seen. But I generally sense a lot of enthusiasm for this, as well as also for an agreement down the road with the European Union. They've already concluded one with the United Kingdom, and Prime Minister right today or yesterday tweeted about that he is going off to the United Kingdom, where the partnership of India with the United Kingdom on these trade and investment stuff has really deepened and all. So he actually explicitly talked about the last one that they signed, and I think there's going to be some formal signing while he's there also. So I think at the top level, I sense that there is a very keen interest in signing the agreements. That's, again, from outside, as much an outsider as all of you are.
Well, good. Well, we got about 5 or 6 minutes for a couple of questions. If you could tell us briefly who you are and try to make the question as quick and punchy as you can. We'll start on the side over there, and then we'll come to the middle. Yep.
Hi. I'm Rishi Iyengar from Foreign Policy Magazine. Thanks so much for doing this. So my question is, recently in the last week, 10 days or so, we've seen both the EU and President Trump talk about India and China's purchases of Russian oil and the threat of sort of secondary sanctions. How seriously do you take those threats, and how vulnerable is India's economy to those kinds of retaliatory measures should they be imposed?
Well, that's a question really for, somebody inside the government. It's not a question that I should be responding to. So I'll have to pass on that one.
Fair enough, yeah.
Yes, hello. So thank you for coming. So my question is, you discuss a lot about the per capita income. Why not talk about credit rating, which has a lot more financial elements, inflation, and creditworthiness? Because, if I can think, Argentina, Sri Lanka, and even Colombia, and many other countries have higher per capita income, but they're not a better economy than India, sir. And also, 52% of India's land is arable, 4th largest ever in the world. So why not just focus on agriculture, considering the resources are such good in terms of agriculture arability? That's like, we have diesel, in North India, but we keep using natural gas. Just want to know a perspective about that as well.
Not sure.
Can you restate? Yeah, can you restate a little sharper?
So about credit rating, which has a lot more financial elements, inflation, there's creditworthiness, there's a lot more than just to per capita income. Why not look at that as to the economy,
No, look, I mean, creditworthiness isn't a necessary requirement for investments to happen. So that's fine. But beyond that, what more is there to say about creditworthiness? India has never defaulted and has gone completely out of the way to avoid the defaults. 1991, when the balance of payments crisis happened, India went and flew its gold to the Bank of England to avoid the default. So as far as India's credit on that score is concerned, it's rock solid. Today, India, of course, is also sitting on something like $700 billion worth of foreign exchange. So there is no issue of default in that sense. If I was worried about the macroeconomic stability issue, which can then undermine growth in the future, then I would have brought that up. But India has always run its macro very conservatively. The government runs its deficits, it watches that like a hawk, during COVID, as everywhere else in the world, India's fiscal deficit went a bit up, 8-9%. But they brought it down very, very rapidly in the in the post-COVID years, and it is heading towards close to maybe 4%. And by the end of our the present in 16th Finance Commission's award period, it will probably come down to 3.5-3% or something like that.
One other related point that you mentioned too, bank NPAs, which was such a crisis, a few years ago.
Yeah.
It hasn't stopped. The drive towards reducing NPAs, a couple of recent RBI reports, India's getting close to record levels of low NPAs.
Yes.
So a lot of good news on that front. So the ability to kind of springboard on that, something we're talking about behind the scenes before we came out. Right. We had one, you had somebody yep, sure. Again, who you are, quick question.
Hi, so I'm Abhik. Thank you for this. My only question is, I sensed a kind of an assumption with our population that, since we grow, so there would be an initial growth at the labor force participation rate, but the proportion of discouraged workers will also grow. So just a comment on how do we plan to balance as we grow forward the proportion of discouraged workers that would rise with our population and our labor force participation.
How do you keep workers from getting discouraged and leaving the workforce altogether? Yeah.
No. Actually, the opposite is happening now. The labor force participation rates have been rising very rapidly in India currently. And part of this 46% in agriculture is because of it had fallen to about 42% 3 years ago, 2019 or 20. It rose significantly because the women labor force participation has gone up in rural India. So there is nobody is getting discouraged and leave the labor force. Certainly, in the labor market surveys, this is the periodic labor force survey, PLFS, that's done by the Ministry of Statistics and Programming. It's very clear the trend. And there are good reasons why this is happening, because a lot of the activities on which women actually had to spend a lot of time, getting water, getting fuel for cooking, etc. All this is gone because LPG, the liquid petroleum gas stoves have replaced all the traditional wood-based cooking. Water is being now brought through the tap water is coming to the households and all. So many of the things which really took away a lot of the time of the women has been freed up. And this is showing up now in the increased labor force participation rates in rural areas. So that's not the problem. India's problem is to create good jobs. That is where the challenge is. So labor force participation, if anything, in fact, if more jobs begin to become available, probably the labor force participation rate would rise even yet more. Because there's a lot of scope, by the way, even in urban India. The women labor participation is very low. It's nothing compared to most the developed countries. So that in fact is another potentially positive source that potentially still got a lot of workforce to exploit if you create an environment in which more jobs get created.
I know we've got about a dozen more hands, but we've reached the witching hour here. Dr. Panagariya, everybody in this room wants to see India meet this goal, whether your company's looking for India as that monster investment and trade destination, whether you're on the development universe and you want to see all boats rise, which would certainly happen as part of this. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to sit here with so many from the DC policy universe, sharing your thoughts, and I think a really balanced perspective on the challenges India has to overcome, but these incredible factors that are moving in absolutely the right direction. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Panagariya for his time.
And thank you. Thank you.